This tutorial will cover UV mapping in Gmax. It assumes you know the basics of the program, including rotating, making the actual model, using the software. If you don't, you'll probably want to start somewhere else first. Now what I like to do is I like to map a lot with planar mapping, and this is going to be especially handy in Gmax since it lacks a lot of the tools that other programs have. So planar mapping is done using 3 planes. The x-plane, the y-plane, and the z-plane. As you can see, certain of the planes will not capture the entire model, and the bonus to this is for the blade, as you can see, I'll need to use the z-plane, as it cuts it right down the middle, lengthwise. And when you have it selected, just hit planar map, and you'll basically get the shape of your blade, and it will contain both sides. Now, the object we just mapped is a little bit distorted, and as you can see here, I didn't really know what I was doing when I was actually filming this tutorial, so bear with me a few minutes while I figure it out. What I'll eventually do is I'll realize that there are individual scale tools for the x-plane and the y-plane, and you can individually scale it left to right or top to bottom to get rid of that distortion, and that's what I'm going to do in a second here. So I'm just going to basically alter it until it looks like a blade and not a big fat tent. And I'll just scale it down so it's in a manageable size. And eventually I want all the pieces to fit inside that gray box there, but right now I'm not going to worry about it, and I'll resize everything later and fit it all in. So I'm simply going to repeat these steps for each part of my model. And I'll pick the plane that seems the most appropriate. As you can see, there's a yellow gizmo each time you choose some faces, and you'll be able to tell which plane to use in order, depending on which way the gizmo is oriented. It shouldn't be real difficult to figure it out. Planar mapping is very handy for boxy or flat type of models, but you'll see when we get to mapping the hilt and the pommel that things will get a little bit more complicated. Because as you can see with the hilt, each of the faces are equal width and equal height, but unfortunately since we're mapping on a plane, it's going to slice it right down the middle, so certain of the faces will be at an angle, and then they'll appear thinner than other faces, which will cause some texture stretching. That can be corrected manually. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem there's a good way to automatically correct for this in Gmax, but it just involves moving some individual vertices over to make sure that each of the faces is about equal. If you don't care, you can leave it, but it tends to give your textures a little bit of a nasty edge, and a lot of people don't appreciate it when your textures are all stretchy in some areas. This gets especially bad for, say, the hilt or the pommel, where you have two faces that are completely perpendicular to each other. And if you were to map them at the same time with one of the planar mapping planes, you would have one face which was perpendicular to the plane of the UV map and one that was parallel. So the one that was perpendicular would have a completely stretched texture, which would basically have one pixel stretched over the whole face. And that is horrible, and a lot of people do that and make that mistake. And that's a mistake that I hope after watching this tutorial you will never make. Always map perpendicular faces separately. So right now we're going to work on the hilt, and you'll be able to see what I was talking about earlier about the hilt having differently sized faces, despite the fact that all of the faces are the equal size. You see the faces right on the outside edge are a little bit shorter than the two on the middle. That's something that you would normally want to correct manually by either taking those top two vertices and dragging them out or scaling them somehow. I'm not going to correct them here, and that's basically as a lesson, because you'll be able to see later how that affects the ultimate texture map by stretching the textures. What we'll do is we'll use a checkerboard pattern to show which faces are stretched and you'll be able to see how it's going to affect your texture before you ever make it. That way you don't waste a whole bunch of time making a texture only to find out that you need to alter your UV map so it'll fit the texture. And if I haven't mentioned it before, it's always better to make a texture to a UV map than to try and fit a UV map to a texture. That's almost impossible, and no one should ever try it. It's kind of a waste of time. So now we're going to work on the pommel, and you'll see what I was saying before about perpendicular faces. As you can see, the front and back side of the pommel are basically in the Z-plane, and the sides are in the X-plane. And I'm going to map to the Z-plane, the whole thing, and then I'm going to go back and take the sides and remap them to the X-plane. And there you can see our entire UV map is basically done. All we need to do now is resize everything to fit it inside that box that I was telling you about earlier. And you never want anything sticking out of the box because then it won't be textured right. Because that box basically represents your texture. Now, which parts are the biggest on your texture map really depends on which parts you think need the most detail. For instance, I'm giving the blade a good section of it, and the hilt will get a good section. The pommel and the bits of the guard, they'll have a smaller part, but not too incredibly small, because with the way we've got this set up, we can give each part it's a pretty decent size of the texture map. Generally, you would want to keep the most important parts, the parts you want the most detail on, those should be the biggest so that you have a good opportunity to texture all that detail in there. What you shouldn't do is make a sloppy UV map just because you think you're not a good texture artist. Because even if you're not, you can always find someone to help you. And practice makes perfect, so you might be able to help yourself. And you don't want to have to go back in a few months and realize, oh, I'm the best texture artist in the world, but I didn't leave myself any space to texture. It happens, folks. People get good over time. You might suck now, but in a couple of months, you never know. So as you can see now, I've got all the parts within this box, and now I'm going to resize the blade just a little to give it a little bit more room since I've got some space on either side. And this is a pretty neat UV map. It's not all sloppy, like some. I'm not an expert, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and apply a checkerboard pattern. And as you'll be able to see, I mistakenly tried to use Gmax's default checkerboard pattern, which was a nightmare. Because you'll see how big it is, and when it's that big, it's absolutely useless, because it's not going to help you see anything, especially not texture stretching. So what I'm going to do, after I figure out how, is add a texture that I made beforehand. It's a 512 by 512 pixel checkerboard pattern in blue, because the one I used to use was blue, so... it doesn't matter what color you make it. You probably want your checkers to be smaller, so that the idea is to have as many checkers on a surface as possible, because that way you can see when they start to change shape or size. And if your checkers suddenly change their shape or start to get bigger or smaller, you want to fix that in your UV map, because it means your texture won't display evenly across the whole model. And that's usually bad unless you can manually compensate, but you really don't want to have to. It's much easier if you can just make your texture, put it on the model, and realize, hey, that looks good. It's never fun to make your texture and put it on the model and go, hey, that looks like crap. So I'm going to apply this, and you'll be able to see the big difference. And you'll be able to see where the texture is starting to stretch. It's stretched vertically just a little bit on the blade, and that probably won't make a whole lot of difference since it's consistently stretched. I'll just have to compensate in the texture map. But you can see on the pommel, especially near the bottom of the pommel, and on the front and sides of the hilt, the checkers are different sizes. Some of them are stretched horizontally, and that's not going to be good. I'm going to want to fix that if I continue with this. And if you saw something like that, you'd want to fix it too. Never leave anything like that.